Afternoon, everyone. We are here to present the fiscal 18 preliminary budget for the City of New York. And I'll say at the outset, this budget, against a backdrop of a lot of uncertainty, and I'll certainly talk about that in a moment. We are still confident that with this budget, we can deepen the investments we're making in this city and the way we will strengthen the city for its people and for its future. And you'll see throughout this budget presentation a focus on targeted strategic investments that we think are crucial to the quality of life in this city and to our economic strength. At the same time, we have achieved historically high savings and historically high reserves. So this budget is assertive in terms of the things that we have to achieve for people in this city right now and in terms of fostering a strong economic future, but at the same time recognizes the uncertainty emanating from Washington, and that is expressed in the very high numbers in terms of savings and reserves. Focus throughout will be, and you'll see it, on sustaining our strong economic standing, building economic growth, and building jobs, particularly high-quality jobs, and that will point out in various investments you'll see in the budget. And we know that underlying a strong economy that works for New Yorkers in all neighborhoods are some fundamental building blocks, most essentially public safety. One of the investments that was made in previous budgets, the 2,000 new police officers between the newly hired and the civilianized officers, the officers freed up by civilianization. Those 2,000 officers, this is the first month where we felt the full force of having 2,000 more officers for the NYPD on patrol. And it is the reason we have been able to implement an aggressive neighborhood policing strategy. It's the reason we have the strong, large anti-terror force we have today. All of that emanated from the decision 2 years ago to invest in having a patrol strength of 2,000 more officers. That's finally fully come to fruition this month, January 2017, and it is the most officers we've had on patrol in this city at any time since 2001, so in over 15 years. That is one of the underlying elements of a strong city and a strong economy, and we've seen it obviously in the great reductions in crime we've experienced. Another thing we need for a strong economy is affordable housing. So far, toward our goal of 200,000 affordable apartments, both new and preserved, we have 62,000, over 62,000 that have either been financed or built or preserved. And 2016, we're proud to say we have the most affordable apartments built and preserved in a quarter century in this city. And finally, another crucial foundation is the quality of our schools. You hear this from folks in the business community all the time in terms of decisions to build a business, start a business, relocate a business. It comes down to the quality of our schools. We know the success we've had with the 70,000 kids in full-day pre-K, that will continue, and all the new pieces that are going to become crucial to our school system, computer science for all, algebra for all, AP for all these pieces are going to build a stronger school system, which will build a stronger economy, including a stronger workforce for the future. So those are all underway, but there is much more to do. And it is clear to us that while we're waiting for the situation in Washington to develop, we've got to keep moving. We've got to keep moving on safety, on improving schools, on building affordable housing, and improving infrastructure. This will be one of the big issues that comes up in Washington. I think we can all safely say we do not know the direction that the President and the Congress will take on infrastructure. We know right now we have crying needs that have to be addressed. And in this budget, you'll see some major new efforts on infrastructure that we're going to undertake no matter what, while we wait to see the direction that Washington takes. The budget, for everyone who's watched this process, it is a very difficult, complex process putting together a budget of this magnitude. I want to thank everyone who's been a part of it. Dean Foulahan and the whole team at OMB have done an extraordinary job weighing all the variables and working through all the details to put together this budget. I want to thank our deputy mayors, Tony Shoris, Alicia Glenn, Richard Bury, Armenia Palacio for their work and their team's work. Don Williams, Chief of Staff to Tony Shoris, who's been in the center of this whole process, Emma Wolf, my Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, and Andrea Hagogans, my Senior Advisor, and their teams for the great work they've done, and of course Bob Lynn as well, our Director of Labor Relations, whose work is reflected throughout this budget and whose successes have helped us to achieve a stable fiscal standing. So thanks to all of them. And now for the basic numbers. The fiscal 18 preliminary executive budget is $84.67 billion. $84.67 billion. For the preliminary expense budget, for the preliminary 10-year capital strategy, that is $89.6 billion. Now, I want to emphasize, in terms of that capital strategy, the focus, as you'll see throughout, is on the kind of investments that have a long-term impact. We, of course, understand when we invest in infrastructure and we make capital expenditures, they have a positive short-term impact economically. They have a positive short-term impact in terms of employment, folks in construction, for example. And that is healthy and that's good. What we're really focused on is the strategic long-term impact of these capital investments, and it's a big and strong capital plan for that reason. And some of this, again, goes directly to building out our economy. Some of the things that we've done, investing in spaces that help facilitate job creation, and particularly the creation of high-quality jobs, like the Brooklyn Army Terminal, Brooklyn Navy Terminal, the Life Sciences Initiative we announced recently. That's one kind of example. What we're doing with something as simple as repaving our roads makes our economy work better, makes us a more appealing place to create jobs, and obviously all of the big foundational investments in policing and affordable housing, in education. All of this comes together to take our economic strength and amplify them and keep building it for the future. Now, it's a good moment for New York City in many ways. We'll go into the details in a moment. But it's also a moment that we're convinced is a time we have to invest while we're experiencing some good times here. We also know, again, that that situation we're facing in Washington could change our assumptions even as soon as the executive budget. So I want to say at the outset that this budget was written with the assumption of profound challenges from Washington, but without the details we need to be able to project what they will be, what shape they will take, in what areas, what dollar figures will be attached. It's just too soon to be able to make decisions, although we have some real indicators that worry us. So it's a budget that focuses on what we can do for ourselves while we wait to see the shape of things in Washington. Now, one of the things we focused on every year is fiscal responsibility. This administration has a very progressive vision and a very assertive vision, but we believe it's only achieved through fiscal responsibility. Happy to say that rating agencies have noticed this. One example recently, Moody's praising, quote, our strong governance and financial best practices, and something we can all be proud of in New York, quote, an exceptionally large and diverse economy. And even just yesterday, Moody's pointed out that, again, quoting, a diverse, vibrant economy drives growth needed to keep pace with fixed costs. There's a recognition from Moody's, from Fitch, from Standard & Poor's that we've handled things in a fiscally responsible manner, and we have a great, strong economic foundation to work with at this point in New York City history. But to keep it that way, we have to focus on savings, we have to focus on reserves. And that is why you're seeing a very aggressive savings program. $1.1 billion in savings have been identified for fiscal 17 and 18. And I've instructed OMB to come back by the time of the executive budget with another $500 million in savings, $500 million in required agency savings. So $1.1 billion in savings we have already identified, and another $500 million that will be reflected at the time of the executive budget. This is in combination with the health care savings. These are the highest savings totals that the city has ever achieved. And I want to thank again our partners in the labor movement who have been very good partners in the area of health care savings. Working with the Municipal Labor Committee, we've saved $1.1 billion from fiscal 15 to fiscal 16, on track to save an additional $1 billion in fiscal 17. So that overall original projection of $3.4 billion in healthcare savings. I want to remind everyone, this is the area, and I said this when I was public advocate, this is the area where government had to do better the most, was healthcare savings for our employees. This was the area where there was the most opportunity to make change. This administration, working with our partners in labor, have been able to prove that we could do a very aggressive savings program, the $3.4 billion on track through fiscal 18. There will be $1.3 billion minimum in healthcare savings every year thereafter. We want to find even more. Savings are one part of the equation, reserves the other part. These are the highest reserves ever achieved by a New York City government, period. We had created the Capital Stabilization Reserve. That's a new thing started in this administration to protect our strong capital spending, to show very clearly that we would always be in a position to make our debt service. That reserve now is going to be stretched out for 4 years and added to. It will now be a $1 billion reserve over 4 years, $250 million per year over the next 4 years. So we're locking in that capital stabilization reserve now. It's not an annual thing anymore. It's now a long-term thing. We've had the same as of last year. We've had a commitment to a $1 billion general reserve, and then the Retiree Health Benefit Trust Fund, which pays for retired employee health care. We started a year ago at this time with a number added to it through the executive budget and the adoption process working with the council. The council was very focused on adding to that number. That number is now all the way up to $4 billion. So when you add those three together, that's a level of reserves we've never been at before, and very appropriate given the times we're going into. Now, here's the federal picture, and just to put this in perspective. And I'm going to point to this because I want to be clear. We all understand we're dealing with the great unknown. And I want to focus on the fact it's not just the president, it's Republican Congress and how the two interact. The president said a lot of things. He's also changed his mind on a lot of things. And very little has been put into formal proposals. Republican Congress has historically been very interested in reducing the size of government and taking away some of the initiatives that would particularly help cities. How those two interact, we don't know. And even within the Republican Congress, there are some very different strands, Freedom Caucus in the House and other more moderate Republicans. So this situation is really unclear at this point, and it will play out over time. The first act we saw around Affordable Care Act looked very sharp and resolute, and at the same time, and I can say this from conversations I had in Washington with members of the Congress and my fellow mayors had, we're hearing lots of mixed signals, including from Republican members of the House and Senate, of how quickly they're going to act on Affordable Care Act, how they will replace it, and when it actually will reach the ground in terms of these changes being felt. It seems clear that a lot of Republicans in the Congress are recognizing the challenges and maybe either slowing down their approach or trying to find ways to lessen the blow. So that is a very dynamic situation. But we laid out here 5 areas, all of which could suffer in terms of our city efforts to help our people. Obviously, in terms of our police force, we've already heard different threats bandied about a potential defunding around security and community policing funding. The public hospital system, this gets right to ACA. What happens with ACA and potential Medicaid block granting has a huge impact on the public hospital system. Education. I've said publicly any effort to achieve school vouchers would be a very difficult one, but that's what the Secretary of Education designate is talking about. That would have a huge negative impact on our public education system. Environmental protection, obviously, deregulation efforts and efforts to not acknowledge the challenge of climate change could have big impacts on New York City and on our budget. And this point here, 400,000 New Yorkers who live in public housing, and then many more, hundreds of thousands, who depend on affordable housing efforts currently funded by the federal government, like Section 8. A long-time target of congressional Republicans, the different programs that go through HUD. This one hasn't gotten as much conversation. We haven't heard a clear message from the president or Secretary-designate Carson, but what we have heard is the president's talking about major tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. That means greatly reduced revenue. Where will a Republican Congress compensate if there's greatly reduced revenue? My fear is affordable housing programs might be one of the first areas they look. And I remember even going back to my years in HUD almost 20 years ago, there were efforts by some of the same Republicans to try and cut back HUD then. I unfortunately assume it will be a major target now. So that's a huge amount of uncertainty, a huge number of moving parts. But we believed, again, we could not write dollar figures into a budget based on this level of uncertainty. What we could do was savings and reserves, and then get ready to make adjustments as we go along. And our belief is by the time of the executive budget, at least some of this will be clear, and hopefully not as bad as we fear. And we see some countervailing pressures, particularly, as I mentioned, around the Affordable Care Act, that might change the trajectory and lessen the blow. Now let's talk about the state budget. We got some good things and we got some concerns here. Obviously, the higher education proposal, the free tuition, is a very impressive one and one that could be great for the young people of this city. There's still a lot of details we need to understand about how and when it takes place. But that's an example of something that could be very good for New York City. Election reform is talked about around the budget and state of state, something we believe in fundamentally and will help us run a better election system. The extending of the millionaire's tax is a given from my point of view. This has to happen at the state level or else the state is not going to be able to keep its obligations. And here's an actual good news category. There has been, after last year's fight over Medicaid, which all of you remember, we've actually seen not only was there a decision by the state, by the governor and his team to not include a Medicaid cut in the state budget, but there's now been day-to-day, week-to-week more commitment by the state to picking up some of the Medicaid at cost that it used to and following through on some previous commitments. So that's been a good thing, and that certainly has been helpful in general and to health and hospitals in particular. Now, concern areas. 421A, we all can agree this is one of the great moving targets we've seen in the last few years. No one knows exactly where it's going. I think we can say it has been moving towards greater resolution. Our concern is the additional costs that are starting to pop up in the process. We put forward a proposal around 421A, very simple standards. Reduce exposure for taxpayers, and that means city taxpayers because we have to pay the bill. More affordable housing, and don't fund luxury housing. It's really simple. The latest negotiations have started to add additional costs, and our concern is how much, when they hit, what impact it will have. Particularly this discussion of condos being added back in is worrisome because that could add, first of all, pulls away from the original concepts of the reform we proposed. Second, could add real costs. So we're watching that closely, and we will be working in Albany to make sure that situation doesn't get out of hand. On education, we also have a lot of questions. We saw some encouraging signs about the potential for increased education aid, but we also see a lot of wording that suggests some particular restrictions and limitations. So that is still being analyzed. I'll be able to say a lot more about that on Monday in my budget testimony in Albany. So this one's a bit of a gray area, but even more of a concern, less for this year, but much more going forward, is there appears to be an effort by the state to change the way it's casting its budgets on the question of the campaign for fiscal equity. So again, this goes back a decade or more now. Decision by the highest court in the state, the Court of Appeals, that there had to be fair funding for every school district according to the mandate of the state constitution. And that for a long time, less privileged districts had not gotten their fair share. That was true of not only of New York City, it was true of upstate cities, it was true of some of the rural areas of the state as well. The highest court in this state decided that under the Eliot Spitzer administration. It began to be implemented, then the recession hit, it was put on hold. You all will remember I've gone to Albany 3 years in a row and raised campaign for fiscal equity commitments. Well, this year for the first time we see an effort by the state to actually end its acknowledgement of the fact that there even was a court decision that drives a commitment. And so that's something we'll be watching carefully. We think this is a set in stone reality that is the obligation of the state to live up to. So we're going to be watching that wording around that very carefully. And then these areas, these are smaller, but they're still worrisome. Cuts to specific programs around public health, foster care, senior centers, special education. Some of these are in the $10 million, $20 million range, but that's real money, and they add up. So we're watching all those, and we'll be talking about all that on Monday. Now, I want to talk about the overall economic situation for a couple minutes and then what it means for us. First, you guys know I care about income inequality. I could not help but bring this up since I've talked about it at each budget presentation each year, but this is one of the most troubling things I've seen in a long time from Oxfam. And the notion that we have 8 people, 8 families with the same wealth as 3.6 billion people. If, I think this whole election year put a point on the question of income inequality. This even more so shows what we're up against. And this is hurting New York City, and it's hurting the entire country. And it's an issue that has to continue to be brought to the fore and addressed. Meanwhile, we're looking very carefully at the national economic picture and what it means for us. And we see a national economy that is growing, although at a moderate pace. That, per se, looks at least satisfactory. We see a lot of strong economic indicators in the city. But I want to differentiate, you have a strong stock market that's good, relatively strong national economy, some very strong indicators in the city, but it does not necessarily translate into revenue. So we see short-term a little slowing. We still see growth, but slowing growth on tax revenue then picks up again in about a year. Here's the interesting question. The part of the equation that has changed, and I particularly want to focus on the real estate transactions. So this is an area where we've seen a change in the market dynamics. We're obviously still trying to assess it. But in general, I'm hearing this from folks in the real estate world. We're seeing it in rent levels and other things, real estate activity slowing. That is something we're watching carefully, and that's another reason why we have some conservative assumptions in this budget, because so much of our revenue is related to the value of real estate and real estate transactions. Now, on the good news side is just how this city has evolved, and we're very proud of what's happened in the last 3 years, building upon previous growth. The job creation dynamic in this city is really extraordinary. So here we have, of all the states in the country, and comparing New York City against the states, there have been 4 states that have more total job growth in New York City: California, Florida, Texas, and the whole state of New York. But other than those 4 very big states, this is literally the number of jobs. In 2014 and 2015, we gained almost 250,000 jobs. We gained more jobs in one city in those 2 years than 46 other states did in this country. That is a very good thing, and that trend, although it's not been quite as fast a pace of growth, we've still seen continued job growth. And the great thing is it is happening with a more diversified economy, and it's happening across the boroughs. So here you see, this is again showing our employment growth compared to the overall rate of growth in the whole country. But look again at how it's construction, it's leisure and hospitality, it's education and health. We have an ever more diverse economy, and that's one of our strengths. Now, the 5-borough reality as well. Oh, this is population growth by borough. We see both job growth and population growth across all 5 boroughs, particular strength in Brooklyn. But this is something that we talked about, and it's actually happening more and more, that we have an economy where we're seeing job growth all around the city, obviously no longer just as concentrated in Manhattan. That population growth, first time we have seen this kind of population growth in many decades, and this is the fastest rate that this city has grown in population since the 1920s, so almost 100 years. And then on tourism, which is a great indicator, 60.3 tourist tourist visits, 7th consecutive year in a row. Travel and tourism now account for 375,000 jobs in this city. And that's extraordinary, $42 billion sector at this point. We still want to see better wage growth in that sector, but the number of jobs it's producing is an extraordinary good news story for this city. And then because of the national debate on immigration, we wanted to show you this just to put in perspective. I think New Yorkers inherently know this, but just to make clear, here we are. Everything I showed you before is a picture of a prosperous, strong city. What makes up that prosperous, strong city? Foreign-born workers are 45% of our labor force. 52% of our business owners are immigrants. Foreign-born households earn $92 billion in income, obviously fueling our economy. And this is a positive example, as these national debates are going on, of how immigration can be good for all of us. Now, I mentioned how important it is to have a diverse economy, and this is important to recognize. Again, we're a city that not long ago was intensely dependent on Wall Street and some allied industries. But now look that in recent years, 50% of employment and wage gains have been in education and health and technology. So again, we are still recognize a very important role for the financial sector, but look at this both growing economy, evolving economy, more diverse, and particularly that technology sector now well over 300,000 jobs playing a crucial role in the city. And we expect that to grow as well as the life sciences sector. So 300,000 folks in tech, I think that could grow substantially. Life sciences with a new initiative would create 16,000 good paying jobs. That's a sector that could get up to 100,000 or more if we play our cards right. Okay. All right, now, I want to talk about some of the key things that we're investing in this budget. And this is just a reminder of some of the areas that we've previously invested in: ballistic vests, smartphones, bulletproof door panels for our patrol vehicles, which are being put in now and will be completed by next year. We want to go farther than that and add additional investments that will help keep our city safe and our officers safe. And we have some very important new additions we're going to be announcing in this budget. So first of all, $275 million. This is over 5 to 7 years it will take to implement. This Robins Neck is our primary training facility for training in weaponry and use of firearms. It's needed an upgrade for years and years. This is going to allow us to train officers to better fight terrorism, to better address an active shooter situation, but it's also going to be crucial to the ongoing training and retraining for everyday dynamics out on the streets of the city. You know, under Commissioner Bratton and Commissioner O'Neill, there's been a huge focus on training and retraining, constant retraining, de-escalation techniques, ways to minimize use of firearms. This is going to help us continue that good work, but also to be able to ever more effectively deal with the dynamics of the world around us. This is also going to be great for the City Island and surrounding neighborhoods that have had a real problem with the noise emanating from Robins Neck, where they not only deal with firearms, they deal with explosives training as well. This is going to allow us to soundproof the situation and end that problem for the surrounding neighborhood. Now, we also are making a major new investment in bullet-resistant window inserts. Now, these are the windows on either side, the driver's side and the passenger side. We've all seen the very troubling footage of officers being attacked in their vehicles, and we had the tragedy that happened here in this city with Officer Ramos and Officer Liu. In addition to the ballistic doors, and that will be for every one of our police vehicles, this will allow us to have every one of those side windows be bullet resistant, and that will be achieved within a year. So this money is going to really allow us to protect our officers further. And then this is a very important additional evolution of our approach. Crisis management system, a lot of you know it as cure violence, gang interruption. There's a lot of phrases that have been used. These are community members who work in a systematic way to stop violence before it happens, to get people to leave gangs, to stop gang activity and gang retaliations, and to work closely with the police. We had a lot of folks in the Cure Violence movement with us when we announced the 2016 successes in terms of reducing crime. They really played an important role, and I think they're going to play an even more important role going forward. So we're adding on top of current funding $4.5 million to deepen that effort. That grassroots part of fighting crime fits very powerfully with the neighborhood policing vision of Commissioner O'Neill and helps us involve community members much more effectively. So this is going to be a big priority in terms of fighting crime. Okay, now let's talk about Vision Zero. Obviously, one of the most important things we can do in terms of safety and saving lives. We put in place these previous initiatives, the speed limit, the street improvements. We've done 193 already. A lot more enforcement. I saw in the Staten Island Advance today that there's been a doubling reported. Well, I knew we had been doing it, but I'm glad to see it reported. A doubling of speeding summonses in the second half of the year, last year in Staten Island. You're going to see more of that, more summonses for speeding all over the city and for failure to yield, because the enforcement piece is crucial to the equation. But there's, in addition to intersection redesigns and re-engineering of intersections and corridors, there's more we wanted to do. So this number is, we believe, very impressive and is continuing. And DOT has gotten the resources to just keep re-engineering intersections and corridors constantly. But we wanted to address other areas as well. And so you'll see that in the next slide. Street reconstruction projects, street lighting, signal improvements, pavement safety markings. These are areas that will help enhance the Vision Zero approach. So this will mean more street lights and traffic signals at key intersections. We'll be adding 15 million linear feet of markings, as a lot of people have noted. A lot of our crosswalks and other areas, the markings had become dulled, and that was making them less effective. So this is going all over the city, 15 million feet of markings that will be restored. Signals, traffic signals, as I mentioned, but also specifically left turn calming measures. This is a big issue, the problem of left turns and the way that contributes to crashes disproportionately. So we're going to have 100 key intersections where we'll be adding left turn calming measures. That will bring our Vision Zero commitment over the next 5 years. When you add up this and a few other things, pushing $400 million now, new in this budget, that will bring the grand total of investment in Vision Zero over the next 5 years to $1.6 billion. And we think we're going to be able to show even greater ability to save lives and protect people as Vision Zero deepens. But another piece of the equation, and it relates to Vision Zero, but it also, I think every parent can relate to this too, and this is very personal for me because, you know, I, as a public school parent, I came to really appreciate our school crossing guards, and they are every day protecting kids. But the more I've looked at the situation and talked to people around the city, the more it was clear that sometimes there were crossings that were not protected, and it was inconsistent. And so the charge I gave to my team was to determine what it would take once and for all to ensure that every place we needed a school crossing guard had a school crossing guard every single day that school was open. Now, we've looked at this carefully, and to the best of our knowledge, this is the first time this is going to have been achieved in this city's history, to actually have the full complement fully budgeted to make this happen. So this is going to mean 100 more supervisors for school crossing guards and 200 more guards on top of those that were previously added in the last budget. We believe that by the time the next school year begins in September, that we will have the capacity to fully cover all crossings, and in the event people are sick or out for whatever reason, to make sure there's redundancy so that they can be replaced very quickly and each day can proceed. So that's something we're very happy to be moving on. A lot of city council members have raised this concern as a major priority, and it's something that we're very committed to. Now I want to talk about some other school-related issues. And we've said, and you're going to hear this a lot, Equity and Excellence Vision, one of the most foundational pieces now. I mean, we've talked about pre-K and the things we want to do to get kids college ready, and all of these building blocks are starting to come in place. But the thing I'm going to focus people on constantly is getting our kids reading by 3rd grade. When I came into office, it was under 30% of our kids reading on grade level by 3rd grade. We're now about 41%. Our goal is to get to 100% over the next decade, next 10 years. One of the things we have to do more is when we have kids in 2nd grade who are lagging on reading, we want them to get a whole summer of instruction. We want to extend the school year for them. So this is not kids, when you think summer school, we all think summer school from our experiences. You think a kid who might be held back goes to summer school so they can now advance to the next grade. This is beyond that. This program called Summer in the City, this is about helping kids get on grade level in reading. This could be a child who was absolutely going to advance from 2nd grade to 3rd grade. That still doesn't mean they're on grade level for reading. We need them to be. So we're going to make this available starting this summer as one of the ways we supercharge our efforts to achieve that goal of all kids reading by 3rd grade system-wide. Also, a big deal to a lot of parents, and this has been one of the issues we hear the most about, I hear most about, council members hear most about around the city. Parents are so concerned in a lot of neighborhoods. Central Queens is probably the most dramatic example, but many other neighborhoods as well, in many other parts of the city, about overcrowding in our schools. We're adding almost $500 million, taking us to a grand total of $4.6 billion. That will create 38,487 new seats, pushing on towards 40,000 new school seats, which will largely alleviate the overcrowding issue we're facing now. Now, in addition, we're going to try and address a very important issue in terms of connectivity in our schools. Computer Science for All has gotten a great reception, tremendous response from the private sector is helping us do it and believes in it. Parents, kids are very excited about Computer Science for All. But to make it all it can be, we have to get our school buildings better connected. So this is $16 million. It will help us system-wide to upgrade internet speeds by the 2019-2020 school year. And this, again, this is literally every school in the city will be reached by that point. Okay, I want to talk about infrastructure now. Again, this is such an important area for everyday life, for people who drive around the city, drive to work, just trying to get around and do their chores, their errands, everything. But it's also important for our economy and the future of our economy that we get this right. We've been very focused on repaving, and we have hit this very high number, the 1,300 lane miles. We're now committing to that again for fiscal 2018, and then again on top of that for fiscal 2019. So for 2 more years, we will be keeping our city at a very high level of repaving. Now, just to give you a frame of reference, by the end of the current fiscal year, meaning by June, since we came in office, we will have repaved about 4,000 lane miles, which is about 20% of all the lane miles in this city. So 4,000 lane miles by this coming June. For your visual representation, that is the equivalent of driving from New York City to Costa Rica. Now, by adding 1,300 more lane miles next fiscal year and 1,300 after that, that is the equivalent of driving from New York City to Bolivia. One of you enterprising journalists needs to go and do this and report on it along the way, just to make it vivid. But this will mean the most repaving that's been done in a concentrated period of time since 1991. So a quarter century ago. This is the most repaving that this city will have done in a quarter century. And yes, pave, baby, pave is the slogan. I want to thank Borough President Jimmy Otto for offering that to our city, and we believe in it. Now, on our water supply. Okay. Want to just make sure everyone's clear on this, because I think there was some confusion in the past, and I think we unfortunately added to that confusion. So let's add to clarity here. Third water tunnel is built. Not all the things connecting to it are built, but the actual tunnel itself is built, thank God. By the end of this year, water will flow into the third water tunnel. You'll all be there to see it. That's going to allow us from that point on to have redundancy, to have the ability, if there were a need, if there were an emergency, to get that water to households in Brooklyn and Queens. That's going to be a real live capacity this city is going to have by the end of 2017. We're investing $303 million to finish everything else related to the third water tunnel on an aggressive schedule. That will take us to 2025. Tony, you with me? 2025? 2025. And then, for once and for all, the third water tunnel will be done. Now, some of you were there when we opened the connection between Brooklyn and Staten Island. So that additional connection has been built and is running. The third water tunnel itself, built, water in it this year. All this money flows and fully completed 2025. Someone, I don't know if anyone in the audience knows when it started. I think it was give or take 1970. But the third water tunnel finally has a light at the end of the tunnel. And then just a couple other quick areas. They're all important. We're going to continue to deepen the commitment to reducing flooding in Southeast Queens. This has been a long-standing problem affecting tens of thousands of homeowners. We've put in major investments. We'll put in more to address this. We're going to upgrade our sanitation trucks, and that's going to allow us to not have so many out of service needing repairs, and big investment in our bridges. This is obviously something we constantly focus on, keeping our bridges in good repair. So those are all major priorities in this budget. Finally, just a couple more things. In terms of public housing and the 400,000 people who live there, this is one that is long overdue. Again, we've seen the lack of federal investment for decades. We have no illusions about the current reality. We attempted to get the state of New York to invest more in these kind of repairs. That's been a very slippery slope. We made a decision to invest an additional $1 billion in roof repair for public housing. Now, I want to be clear. There's already roof repair in the most needed developments happening now. A lot of you may have seen the coverage of Queensbridge houses the other day, one of our biggest, in fact, the biggest development. So we've already got a lot of money booked to fix roofs in developments that have had serious roof problems, and that means leaking, and it means mold, and it means health problems. This is now going to allow us to do 729 more buildings. It says roofs, but I want to say it better. 729 more public housing buildings will have their roofs fixed. That is, I need to get the exact number, I think that's almost 30% of our buildings. So we have roofs that are already financed to be fixed. We have 729 we're going to do here. There's some that are being reached by money that's come from FEMA and HUD as a result of Sandy. There's a lot that's going to happen. But this is the, as far as we can tell, this is the grand total we need to fix every roof that has a problem that's creating a mold and other health problems. So these are all the grand total of the most serious problems. We're going right at them. Very different area, but also very important about righting some wrongs. We have 90,000 people in the city who work for nonprofits doing social service work. They have been historically underpaid. We gave them a cost of living increase earlier in the administration. We extended the $15 minimum wage that we were doing for city employees to this sector as well. We're now going to do another cost of living increase to help get this sector more support, and it will be consistent with the city labor pattern. All right, and then a couple other quick things I want to go over. Sonic Summer is a program that's existed over the last few years. We think it now makes sense to fund it fully. This is for this year. It's not baseline, but we're going to fund it for this summer for 22,000 kids. Summer youth employment, this is an area I think everyone knows has been a major, major concern for the City Council. I met with the Speaker earlier. I met with council members earlier. We have a task force with them that we announced at the time of the last budget adoption to try and figure out how to improve this program and to try and figure out what size it should have for the long haul. What we're doing in the meantime is doing 65,000 seats for this summer. It was 60,000 last summer. Very happy with the results. We're going to 65,000. And to put it in context, from the day we walked in the door, this is a doubling of the number of summer youth employment opportunities that existed just 4 years ago. Finally, I mentioned the life sciences. We've announced this before, but this is just for emphasis. Another thing we're very happy about, $150 million to develop a campus and incubator for life sciences. Again, a sector we are very, very enthusiastic about. We want to make sure the infrastructure is there to support it. So Dean will come up and do a couple of quick facts in a moment, but I want to say again a thank you to everyone from my team who worked so hard and I think did a great job on this budget. Also want to thank the Speaker of the City Council, Melissa Mark Viverito, and the Finance Chair of the City Council, Jalissa Ferreras Copeland, and the council staff and all the council members who have been partners throughout. A lot of their input is seen in this preliminary budget. And in conclusion, look, it's a hackneyed phrase, but it's true. A budget is a statement of values. This is a budget that represents the values of this administration. It's a budget that recognizes things that had to have been addressed for many years and now are being addressed. It's a budget that is strategically minded about protecting the city for the long haul. And we think it gets at the concerns that everyday New Yorkers raise to us all the time in an effective way. Just a few words in Spanish before I bring up Dean. Hoy presentamos un plan de gastos justos, responsable y digno de todos los neoyorquinos, que da a miles de niños el apoyo que necesitan para aprender a leer, da a los policías capacitación necesaria para salvar vidas y disipar situaciones de crisis, y nos ayuda a mejorar las condiciones de salud en los hogares de familias de NYCHA. Just some of the highlights in Spanish. With that, I bring forward our Budget Director, Dean Foulahan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to be brief and just go over a few of the financial plan slides, and there will be a technical briefing after this press conference. The slide that we spend most of our time on is talking about the changes since the last quarterly update in November. As you can see from the, I'll do just very top line, but you can see from the very top line, we had a gap to close of $2.2 billion to reach a balance in this budget. We did that in a variety of ways. One of them was not a significant increase in revenues. Just like in November, there was very little change in the city revenue base. The mayor talked about that. In prior years, we've had increased revenues, but the forecast that we had with the adopted budget was very much on mark. So unlike many other municipalities, we've not had to make major adjustments because we had very cautious revenues. Those cautious revenues continue. On the expense, to deal with very targeted no, let's stay on that slide, please. I'm sorry. To deal with the expense changes, the agency expense changes for the 2 years, 17, 263, and 427 in 18. Those are covered by what follows. The citywide savings plan that the mayor talked about, $1.1 billion in savings in this plan on top of the $1 billion that we did in November, in addition to now the directive the mayor has given us on the $500 million for the executive budget. That with other very similar financial plan actions that we take in every preliminary budget, and I'm happy in the technical briefing to go into more detail, allow us to balance the fiscal. We stay in balance in 17. We reach a balanced budget in 18. And then at the very bottom, the gaps to be closed in 19, 20, and 21 remain historically low compared to what they've been, and very important, the mayor talked about they include in every one of those years the $1 billion general reserve and the 250, which we did not have in the out years, the 250 capital stabilization reserve. The next slide is the 5-year total financial plan on revenues and expenditures. And once again, after this, if we need more questions, I'm happy to go into it, but it talks about the city fund number, which is $61.5 billion. And then the following slide The next slide is the one that does the 5-year plan, and the all funds number the mayor referred to at the bottom, the 84.6 for the fiscal year 18. I'm going to quickly move through. If you would, the next slide just shows where the dollars are going and where the major expenditures on, and now the capital plan. So the next slide in the capital plan, we do this every 2 years. We do the 10-year strategy. So this slide simply tells you the total city funding, the total that the mayor referred to, the 89.6. Most of that is city through either our general obligation or our transitional finance authority and the municipal water authority, and then a portion of federal and state. The next page, the mayor did talk about the increase in this, but the next page talks about affordability, the measure that New York City and that monitors use on us and have used for years is 15% of our tax base. As you can see, for this administration, we have, while an aggressive, as the mayor talked about, an aggressive capital plan, we have and will continue to stay below that level using very cautious revenue estimates. And the final slide, and then I'll turn it back to the mayor, gives just a broad overview of where that emphasis is and how the 89 breaks down. And with that, I'll turn it back to the mayor.
Thank you. It's time for questions. Let's start way in the back. Bob.
Mayor de Blasio, public hospitals estimated, it was quoted in the state controller's report that as of June 30th, they'll have like 7 days of operating revenue. Do you anticipate, as suggested by the state control, that you might have to spot them to the $300 million between now and the close of this budget year?
No. Right this minute, because they have had some new revenue dips, but they've also had more Medicaid dollars coming in. And I want to thank Dean and his team who've worked very intensely with the state budget office on this. A lot of outstanding Medicaid support that we were not able to finalized with the state has started to flow. So they've actually gained comparatively. So right now our assumption is that we're going to get through this fiscal year with current resources. Now next fiscal year is a whole different discussion. We have to look at that going up toward the executive budget. But if the immediate question is now to June 30, we feel good. After June 30, we're going to look at what we may need to do, but also by then we think we'll have something of a picture in terms of the federal situation. Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, I just thanked City Council Speaker and the Finance Chair. They both just released a press release talking about the budget, saying that while they are pleased with some of the programmatic savings and the increase in reserves, they say that more must be done to find additional lasting savings across all city agencies. Are you being prudent enough, given the economic outlook and also the uncertainties coming from Albany and Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, look, first of all, we have systematically, over the previous 3 years, been trying to improve the efficiency in city agencies and also look at programs or approaches that we think don't reflect either our values or the best way to get things done. So this is not like the first time we've been to this rodeo to try and figure out how to make our agencies better. On top of that, we have the additional mandate for $500 million, for $500 million. So I think the council may have a specific agency or specific issue they may they may disagree with us on, but we feel we've systematically looked at the agencies to continue to improve them. When you take the overall reserve levels, with the consistency of the savings plan and on top of that the health care savings plan, and then $500 million more, we think that's very, very healthy. Now, if you said to me, could we confront something absolutely unexpected from Washington? Yes, we could. But from what we know right now, this is the right number to bank on. Grace?
Just to follow up on that, I'm wondering if you can, a number of council members we spoke to came out of the briefing. The top thing they spoke about was what we heard from the speaker and the budget chairwoman, the fear of what the Trump administration will mean for the city. Can you tell us, I know you've spoken a lot about your disagreements with him on policy matters, but how concerned are you about budget cuts that could be coming to the federal government? And can you give us any ballpark estimates that you and your budget team are dealing with?
No, because I think I really think it would be, it's a perfectly fair question, but I think it would be irresponsible, literally irresponsible, to try and project things where there's no guideposts at this point. Again, I'm trying to be as straightforward as I can be. The president himself has changed his vision on a whole host of issues. You know, if you go over the course of the 2 years, there's lots of areas where he's changed his mind. We don't know until we see actual budgets and actual proposals where he's going to end up. Then there's the Congress, which is going to have a mind of its own, where there's huge fissures in the Republican Party. And by the way, when it comes to the Senate, this doesn't get enough attention. You know, the Senate's only a 2-vote difference, right? Or four officially, I guess I should say. There's 48 Democratic senators. That was actually a net gain of 2 for the Democratic Party. A couple of Republican senators disagree on something, it can't happen. So I think there's a lot of volatility, but there's also opportunities to stop some bad things from happening. And I mentioned Affordable Care Act. I think that's one where a lot of Republicans are sobering up quick about the ramifications of taking health care away from 20 million people and are thinking twice about that. I think the marches this weekend were a powerful statement that's going to be in the minds of a lot of people in the Congress, including on issues like Planned Parenthood. So it's a very fluid situation. So we came to a very simple decision. We said we're not going to project numbers in a dynamic where there's nothing to work with that's tangible and fixed. We share the concern of the council that we could end up in a very tough situation. Excuse me. But one, we have the highest reserves we've ever had. 2, we have an additional savings program moving right now. And 3, we have all the way until the executive budget. So we have, 3 more months to figure out where this is going and then hopefully lock in a little bit clearer numbers.
Mr. Mayor, can you talk about your budget for homeless services and ACS?
Yeah, we, again, this is part 1 of 2 parts, right? Preliminary budget and executive budget. We have continued in this budget a lot of the investments we needed to make to continue to improve our approach to homelessness. We'll have a lot more to say on that going forward, particularly toward the executive budget. But look, I'd say the big strokes here are the Homestat initiative, which as of this moment, going back to March, most of a year, 700 people have come off the streets, and we're seeing good evidence of them staying off the streets. So Homestat is the big strategic effort around street homelessness. We see some good initial results. And then the effort to stabilize and ultimately reduce shelter population with the anti-eviction legal services, the rental subsidies, new initiatives to try and get community families to reunite. There's a lot of things in play that we're seeing some good signs on. Now, every time I talk about homelessness, I say this is going to be a long battle. It's going to be a long battle. But we believe we can turn the tide, and you can see consistency in the investments in this budget. On ACS, this is not, from our point of view, a money question first and foremost. It's about deepening reforms. We've already been putting a big emphasis on training caseworkers and providing them more support. That is going to deepen under a new commissioner. Again, at the time of the executive budget, we'll have a chance to think about if there are new needs there we have to address. Way back.
So you said, I think, you put about $1 billion.
Louder.
Put about $1 billion in the general reserves, which is a little over 1% of the budget. I understand you're saying you're not projecting numbers because you don't know federally how things are going to shake out. But are you doing anything to prepare as far as where you're going to find that money? Should it be over and above that $1 billion level?
Well, look, you've been around and you know that any reserve in an emergency can be tapped into. Obviously not our goal, but in a real emergency, that's an option. And we can make other cost savings moves. There's all sorts of things we could do. I think we need to keep in mind I don't minimize this threat at all. I do not minimize it at all. That's why I showed you the 5 areas just to give the sheer extent of how we could be hit on any and all those fronts. But I also think it's important to recognize each and every one of them is going to be its own fight. We are going to gather together with mayors around the country and a lot of other concerned folks around the country to fight cuts to our budget and bad policies. And remember, this is really unusual to have an administration that does not have a popular vote mandate attempting such an extreme agenda. There's going to be a lot of pushback from a lot of places, and that Senate piece is crucial. Trump administration loses a few senators on any given issue, they can't move that agenda. So there's a lot to play out, and thank God Chuck Schumer is the Senate Minority Leader, which gives me extraordinary confidence that when something bad can be stopped, it will be. And certainly that New York City's interests will be looked out for. So I don't minimize the danger, but I'm also not going to start making assumptions before we have enough information. I think when you have unprecedented reserves, literally unprecedented, over $5 billion in reserves in the fiscal 18 budget, and you have more savings on the way, that's the right way to start. Again, in 2-3 months, when we come back with the executive, we'll have a chance to update that, and we'll know a lot more.
Mr. Mayor, a question about revenues. I know that revenues are growing, albeit more slowly.
Correct.
If you separate out the revenues that tend to be more sensitive to the economic circumstances,
Yeah.
like sales tax and personal income tax, some of the fiscal watchdogs who are looking at this budget are saying, you know, they came in under projection for this year. And
They came in under projection. Explain just illustrate what you mean.
well, that what they're being told in their briefings is that the personal income tax and sales tax came in under what you had estimated they would be for this year. Is that true? And also, are you lowering your projections for those taxes for next year? And is that just out of an excess of caution, and by how much?
So once again, the revenue estimates, you're right, are very cautious for both years. They were at adoption. I want to go back to this because you're seeing changes in most municipal budgets. We did a modest reduction already in November. And what you see in this year, when you saw on that revenue go up a little, some of that actually we already know. It's higher audit levels, so it's not personal income tax changes or corporate tax changes. It's recognition that we actually have audit dollars already in. It's a recognition that the property tax, which you referred to.
For the rest of humanity, explain what you mean when you say audit dollars.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the state and the city actually in corporate taxes and in financial taxes actually do joint audits of businesses to make sure that the reconciliation is accurate. Those levels of audit activity are coming in much higher than we anticipated.
Again, a little translation. So we did the audits and they got more money because
Correct.
of it. And can you give people a little shape to that?
It's about 300 million more.
But did sales taxes come in lower than you anticipated?
You know what I'll be happy to do if we're going to go tax by tax after this, let's do that tax by tax. I will say that the property tax actually came in a little bit higher than we anticipated.
So let me stay next to me. I want to say, the question, look, I want to validate the question strongly and say we think it's good to be real cautious. And I think it's fair to say we were very cautious in our assumptions last year and coming to this year. The state was a little less cautious. They had to do some catching up. So I think caution has served us well. I think it's fair to say, in general, our estimates held. There may be some areas where we got a little less or more, but in general, we think we came in cautious, and that was good because it was realized. And we'll go through each one with you.
And I will add, I believe that you will find these forecasts are consistent with what outside monitors put out in November and December.
Marcia.
Mr. Mayor, what exactly will you do if there's less money from Washington than you would like to get? And will the fear that President Trump could be vengeful cause you to alter your tactic of publicly opposing him?
No, I think that's an absolute misunderstanding of President Trump. Again, I believe he respects strength and responds to strength, not weakness. And I also think it is the obligation of the mayor of New York City to stand up for the people in New York. It's just as simple as that. So we're not going to take something that would take away, for example, an effort to take away health care from our people. We're not going to take that lying down. We're not going to be friendly and nice about that. It just does not make sense. I reported to you guys the last conversation I had with President Trump was perfectly pleasant on the topic of getting the security reimbursement for the Trump Tower. I believe if one is firm and consistent, that is the best way to deal with him and to deal with his team. And also what this weekend said to us, I hope everyone, look, I don't want to just editorialize for the fun of it. I think this is really an extraordinary moment. I've been very interested in American politics my whole life. I've never seen anything even close to this. This was the single biggest protest of a new president in the history of the Republic. And it was extraordinarily well organized, and it was vast. There's a reason. And it has to do with the lack of popular vote mandate and the extremism of some of the things he suggested. But that's going to now mean he's going to deal with constraints. You don't have 1 million people show up and not feel some restraint, and that's going to happen over and over again. So the reason I say that is speaking up is part of ensuring that the worst things don't happen. I fundamentally believe it.
If I could just follow up,
Please.
New York is a sanctuary city, and he has vowed to take away aid from sanctuary cities. What will you do if he does that?
Again, I think it's fair, and I say this with respect for the president, but I think it's a statement of fact. He has moved on a number of issues just in the last year and a half. Right now, there's a lot of people speaking up. The faith community, including the Catholic Church and Pope Francis, have been very, very strong on this issue of not tearing apart families of immigrants and people who are part of our communities. Law enforcement has spoken up. Our Commissioner Jimmy O'Neill has spoken up. The Chief of Police of LA, Charlie Beck, has spoken up and said that anything that would defund law enforcement and undermine our ability to work with immigrants would make our cities less safe. So I think even if such a thing were proposed, it would be very rough sailing for that proposal, and a lot of pushback would occur. And I think it's understandable, given such an extreme set of proposals, why people say, look, this could have a huge negative impact. But I don't think the rules of democracy have been suspended. A lot of things get proposed in this world and then get rolled back or decreased or reversed because of public outcry. And I think there's going to be more public outcry, and we have evidence from this weekend, more public outcry than we've seen in any similar scenario in our history. So that's why I think standing up, speaking up matters. In terms of the question of contingency, yeah, Marcia, I would say we're ready with the highest reserves this city's ever had and with a constant program to find new savings. But we're not going to jump the gun and start filling in blanks on something that might not happen. Let's try and stop it from happening first. Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, despite the healthcare savings that you've discussed, fringe benefits is still the fastest growing item in your expense.
Are you saying pensions?
No, what's called fringe benefits here.
You'll help us all in terminologies, but go ahead.
So I'm wondering what kind of plans do you have to restrain these escalating costs?
Yeah, so I'm going to speak in plain English, and then he'll speak budget. As I said, back when I was public advocate, I worked on this and have believed in it ever since. Whereas pension costs are determined by Albany, and a lot of decisions were made over the years that pumped up our pension costs in ways that are a challenge. The area where we really can make an impact here is on healthcare. And what I've been very pleased by is that our partners in labor have understood it is in everyone's interest to do that and have participated energetically, and we know there's a lot more that we can do together. So we're going to keep finding additional savings in healthcare. Now, at the same time, and Dean will speak to this, there's another challenge, and everyone with eyes to see understands it. More and more people retiring from city service and living longer, which is a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. But it adds to the costs in ways that were not the case so much in the past. So I think one of the things you're seeing is that natural growth of the cost. But in terms of our ability to reduce the cost with a host of new initiatives, I remain confident.
So the major driver there is healthcare, and what the $3.4 billion over the 4 years. That $3.4 billion, those costs would have been significantly higher without the agreement that the mayor referred to with the Municipal Labor Committee. In addition, what you're looking at is also projections in the out years after 18 when it's $1.3 billion, and what the mayor said just a few minutes earlier was that he is going to be looking for additional health care savings to continue that process, which directly addresses that growth rate.
Yeah.
The new agency expense changes since the November 2016 plan, $263 million this year, $427 million next year. How much of that is for DHS, and what are the other new agency expenses?
DHS is $70 million in the current year, I want to get it. 150, yes, 150 million in 18. The majority of that is for shelter costs. There, however, is a $20 million piece that begins in this year and that continues in every year thereafter, which is for shelter security. And that is also paralleled with some additional expense items at the NYPD that are doing additional security and additional training for the DHS security personnel. The other, that's a major piece. The mayor also highlighted the school crossing guards, the 300 school crossing guards and supervisors, and also the IT efforts that are being done at the Department of Education. That's the vast majority of what you're seeing there. The others are very small items, and afterwards we're happy to go through them.
And let me just add on that, you know, those two examples I want to raise, like the IT efforts. I mean, we all know Department of Education for a long time was not doing well enough on its information technology around kids with special needs. We've invested a lot to fix that once and for all. That's going to make things so much better for families with special needs and all the people who serve them, but that's a big expense. And the NYPD involvement in the shelters is really an important evolution. And I want to thank Commissioner O'Neill's been a very, very close working partner on this. And remember, this was not done, you know, modern homelessness goes back to the Koch administration. This is the first time the NYPD has taken on responsibility for reworking the entire approach to security in shelters. And they've done it very, very effectively, but it's also taken, you know, once they looked at the whole picture, they said, here's what's going to take in terms of NYPD personnel, and here's what's going to take in terms of other peace officers and other personnel. Having the, you know, the leading security experts in the world say, this is what it's going to take to really rework shelter security and make it work for the long term. Of course, that came with a price tag, and it was a worthy price tag. But I want to note historically, if the homelessness crisis goes back, give or take 40 years, this is the first time we've had the NYPD leading the charge to make sure that shelters are safe. Yeah.
How many speeding tickets do you anticipate giving more of, and how much revenue do you expect to generate as a result?
The question is valid but wrong. Now, why? Because I don't mean it's wrong for you to ask. I'm saying it's not. I really want to emphasize, we do not in any way, shape, or form believe in those kind of numerical goals. And second of all, it is not about revenue. It is about Vision Zero working. I believe if we do our job right, it's kind of like speed cameras. The better we do, the more people change behavior. If you think, I'm not sure you would ever speed, you're an upstanding citizen, but if you ever think about speeding and you knew that 1 minute into it you would be pulled over and given a really substantial ticket, you wouldn't speed. So we want to change behavior by showing people there will be ever more enforcement, and that we think will then lead to a reduced need for enforcement. So it's not based on a numerical goal. My message to Commissioner O'Neill and his team is, I want to see the maximum enforcement that will help us drive down crashes. Figure out what that is, precinct by precinct, what that looks like, but keep pumping it up till we get that level, and more checkpoints as well.
Is there any way to quantify that at all?
There's not a standing plan. I've asked them to come back with those adjustments, and then again, if at some point they put it together in a specific set of numbers, we'll certainly give it to you. But the mandate has been, and some of this is, again, precinct by precinct and month by month, and it changes, but the mandate is intensify efforts at enforcement so we really start to change behavior.
Just one more follow-up. Do you expect more police officers to be enforcing speeding limits on the streets and the highways, et cetera?
I don't, the reason I want to hesitate on this is, again, I think it varies by precinct, varies by month of the year, et cetera. It's a major, major priority for this administration and for the NYPD. How they make their personnel adjustments, I can't speak perfectly to, but I expect it to be a major part of the NYPD's mission. It has been, and that's only going to grow.
Given the importance of Wall Street as a job generator, revenue generator, and the fact that we're like corporate headquarters for a lot of corporations, what's the argument for stronger Wall Street regulation, and what's the argument against reduced corporate income taxes, both of which are being pushed by...
Sure. I'll give you the once-over. The argument for both preserving the Wall Street regulation we have and ultimately strengthening it is to avoid another crash, which is still a real possibility, and to put in place the kind of safeguards that we can depend on for the long term. I think we have Dodd-Frank itself has never been fully realized, and already there's talk of rolling back key provisions. So my argument would be that we saw the most intense dislocation of the lives of people of this city and this country since the Great Depression. And anyone with eyes to see can say that we're not out of those woods yet. We have not proven that can't happen again. And the mission of regulation is actually to put some lines in the sand to ensure that certain things cannot happen. And we're not there. On the flip of that, if you start to reduce that regulation and run the risk of riskier activity happening that could lead us toward a crash or a major economic crisis, that speaks for itself why that's a bad idea. On the taxes, look, I'm just not a supply-sider. You know, I don't believe that giving more money to the wealthy and corporations results in an economy that's more fair. I think it unfortunately results in greater concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the few. I mean, that slide earlier, you know, when I was a college student at NYU, and I thought there was unfairness in the world, if you had said, could that ever happen, I would say, no, it's not that unfair. That could never happen. Well, it happened in my lifetime, and it's getting worse. And tax cuts for the wealthy and tax cuts for the corporations will only amplify that. It's not going to, I think we saw this with Ronald Reagan. It does not spur the economy across the board. It does not create higher paying jobs for American workers. In fact, supply side economics is part of the beginning of why so many jobs left this country and why there was a race to the bottom on wages and benefits. So what works, I believe fundamentally, is a government that has the revenue to invest in the economy, to stimulate the economy, to create new infrastructure and jobs, and a well-regulated free enterprise system, but it has to be well-regulated. Yeah.
Speaking of taxes, I know that President Trump and Congress have proposed eliminating the deductibility of state.
Yes. Well, let me be careful. I want to. President Trump, I think, is well aware of this concern. I have not seen his specific proposal. I know in the Congress there are people who have. So I just want to be careful about my knowledge base on this. There is a real fear this could be on the docket in terms of any tax reform.
Did you talk to him about that? That's not my question.
Yes.
You talked to him about this?
Yeah, when I sat, you know, when I told you guys about the original meeting the week after the election, I went over a bunch of issues. This actually did come up as well, and I raised it, and he focused on it. I think it made sense to him from the perspective of New York City, what a negative impact it would have on New York City and other parts of the country. That's not saying he stated a position, but I can say it registered with him. And I know a lot of people in public life and in the private sector are reaching out to him and making the point that this would be a really horrible thing for his hometown if this change were made.
So if that change were made, would you consider seeking lower tax rates approval?
That's a theoretical. I have to tell you, I'm in a real simple place on this. We have to stop that from happening. And Dean may want to comment on it. This would be a very negative sea change and unprecedented and harmful. You know, look, yeah, it comes back down to basics. If you believe in the NYPD and 36,000 members of the NYPD, then you should not want to see a change in how we approach local tax deductibility. It's as simple as that. If we lose that, then all of the things we do in local government are put in danger. I think we can win that battle on its face. I think not only do I believe we can appeal to the president and his team, a huge number of New Yorkers in his team, and I've had this conversation with the Treasury Secretary as well, Mr. Mnuchin, who's keenly aware of it. You know, I think we can appeal to the members of his team. I think we can appeal to a lot of people in the Senate on both sides of the aisle to say this would be fundamentally destructive. I think Chuck Schumer is going to fight real hard on this one. So I'm not going on to scenarios. This is one we have to win at the point of contact. Anna?
Given the increases that you guys are projecting in the property tax levy, as well as just the increases that homeowners see on their bills, have you thought about any property tax relief or considered potentially incorporating any relief?
I'm really consistent on this point. We have a red line here. We're not going to increase property tax rates, period. We've done it 3 years, we've said it. This is the 4th year I'm saying it. We're not increasing property tax rates. We're trying to get relief. We've lowered the growth of the water bill rates, and we're trying to get relief for homeowners, as you know, and still fighting in court over that on the water bills. That's what we're doing. We are not venturing into other areas in terms of property tax change now. I've also said, and you've heard me say it, that a much bigger thing has to be attempted in the city of overall property tax reform, which is a vast multi-year effort and one that I am committed to getting to when we can. But no, I'm standing exactly where I was. Property tax rate will remain exactly where it is.
So would that be if you won this year, re-election?
Again, I'm saying very simply, I'm presenting you a budget for next year, or the next fiscal year. We're focused on what we're doing right now. I'm very clear at the appropriate time there needs to be an overall effort to reform our property taxes. David?
In the financial plan, so for the fiscal year 2017, there's about $8.8 billion in federal grants. That goes down to about $7 billion. Is that already you taking into account possible funding increases?
No. Let me just stop here. I think I've said it a bunch of times. I'm going to say it again. No. There are not Trump-specific things in here. I don't know how many times to say it, guys. We very consciously, we have such a moving target. If someone needs to ask me again, because I really think I'm articulating this. He himself has changed his mind on a bunch of stuff. You have a very closely split Congress. You have a split Republican Party in the House. You've got all sorts of things. We can't project with all those moving parts. And it's the preliminary budget, and the executive is a time where we hope to at least be able to know something. So I just want, there's no place, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no Trump-specific adjustment in the budget. The only thing you might say is at all related to that is intensifying reserves and savings because of federal uncertainty. Given that the economy got somewhat better, you might have felt less need to do that, but if any part of us was getting optimistic, the extremely uncertain situation in Washington has caused us to double down on caution and reserves and savings.
I just want to add, on the new agency spending, is there any new money going to the law department for outside counsel to address the investigations beyond the $10 million that was already budgeted?
There is an additional amount in the law department, I believe, of about $8 million. A total for all legal, am I off?
6.
I apologize, $6 million.
For which year is that?
It's for the current year, and it's for many different cases. We'll get you a breakdown.
Mayor, you mentioned some concerns about the real estate market slowing down. What's the practical implication of that on the budget since the property tax levy is continuing to go up? Are there other places where that's going to affect city revenue?
Well, I'll let Dee go into detail, but here's what I'm saying. It was more me trying to say we are very sensitive to areas that we think are soft. And you know, you've seen our projections in terms of revenue. It's really me saying we think we're taking a cautious stance and a conservative stance in terms of estimating revenue. At the same time as I think there is some slowing in real estate, again, there's overall growth in jobs, and we see strengthening in other sectors of the city. So that's just me affirming that we think these revenue estimates are cautious.
Mr. Mayor, I have 2 questions. The first, I didn't hear you mention anything about aid to undocumented immigrants in the city. You highlighted what an important part of the city they are. Is there anything that is in this budget? I know you were saying there's no Trump-specific things, but you talked about how this is a big concern.
Yep. Yeah, so I appreciate the question. We made a conscious decision on that front. First of all, as you know, largely because of the focus on this from the City Council, there is funding currently available to people who have deportation cases. And to the best of our understanding, that funding is sufficient at this point. And the central idea there is to keep families together, to not have a New York City family broken up by someone being inappropriately deported, especially if they're the breadwinner for that family. So that money is in place and is serving its purpose right now. We looked at it, again, as not wanting to be theoretical, especially when we knew we were coming back in just 3 months. We don't know what, because we've heard this, if ever there's been a moving target. Remember when it was deport all undocumented? I have witnesses, right? Remember that one? And then it was, well, we're just going to deport the criminals. Remember the evolutionary nature of Mr. Trump's statements. And that's before he runs into a wall of opposition, which I guarantee you he will run into. So we did not want to project what this would mean until we saw more. If there is a larger deportation effort, we're certainly going to work with the City Council to keep New York City families together, but there's no way to put a shape to that at this point, so that would be for the executive budget. What, did you have a second?
Yes, there was a $10 million allocation in last year's executive budget for homeless students that is not in this preliminary.
Yes.
Why not include that, given that that number keeps climbing, and do you expect it to be in the executive?
Yeah, I expect it to be an executive in some form or fashion. We're trying to figure out, look, this is an area where we're trying to figure out the best approach. Quick backdrop, we're going to have a lot more to say on our vision for addressing homelessness in the coming weeks. One of the things I'm very concerned about is changing the nature of our shelter system to focus on getting people to shelter in the borough they come from, and then ultimately even closer to home to the maximum extent possible, particularly if it's a family with children. Because, and you know, we went through the whole issue with school buses for kids in shelter. The system was never built this way. And again, this is a 40-year-old system. It was never built to keep people close to their home. We want to rebuild it with that in mind. That will take time. That will take a lot of time. But we are focused on doing that. Why am I saying that? Because as we evolve this system, what we're going to have to do for kids will hopefully change with it. For example, if we get a lot of kids closer to their home school district or in their home school district, that's going to take, thank God, less school busing. But in terms of some of the services we're trying to provide to kids in shelter, we think that's going to be necessary, but we're trying to figure out what that looks like exactly and how much it's going to cost. This year, we have a plan in place. We're evaluating it. We got time by the executive budget to come back with a specific figure. Willie?
Two things. What is the total number for Department of Homeless Services in FY18, and what is the total spending number for 17?
I'll get you the agency
Second
specific
question is, you spoke of $5 billion in reserves. Does that mean in a crisis you can go into the reserve for the Retiree Health Benefits Trust Fund to cover operating costs?
Okay, I'll start and Dean will continue. Look, it depends on the nature of the crisis how we would look at anything. After 9/11 was a particular sudden shock to the city, for example, and Mayor Bloomberg had to take every tool he had to help get the city back on its feet. Then there's everyday situations like minor economic downturns or some cut in federal aid. There are magnitude questions. I think the simple answer is, if you have reserves, you try not to touch them. If you're going to touch your reserves, your general reserve is where you start. And you proceed with great caution, and simultaneously you have other things you can do. You can deepen your savings plans, for example, in agencies. You can cancel things that you were going to implement. There's lots of tools. But to the broader question of could you ever?
So the mayor's right, and if we go back, there are many different options before you get to the reserve level. The continuation of savings on the reserves. The general reserve is there for that purpose. It's at $1 billion. That, with our capital stabilization reserve, is actually nearly $1 billion over what this city had done for the past 20 years before that. So there's already $1 billion every single year in reserves. The Retiree Health Benefit Trust Fund, while we built it year after year, and it's at the highest level it's ever been, and $3.3 billion of that $4 billion is the result of this administration. Yes, it has in the past and was used by the Bloomberg administration during the Great Recession.
Who hasn't gone yet? Let me go ahead.
Why has the city decided not to fund half-fare Metro cards for?
Very clear. Look, again, I think it's a noble goal. It is, first of all, something we cannot afford to do. And second of all, it should be the responsibility of the state of New York. As I like to say in these gatherings, the state of New York controls the MTA.
Doesn't the city fund the subsidies for seniors, for discounts for seniors and students on Metro?
There are different areas where we've contributed to the MTA, but my central point is still this. One, we can't afford it. That sort of makes the whole question moot. But I also think the cart and the horse are wrong here. The MTA is the state's responsibility. It's a center. They have the majority vote. They are the #1 funders, et cetera. I think this is good policy. They should fund it. We're not in a position to fund it. Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, given your emphasis on infrastructure, how confident are you that you can get Albany to enable the city to do design-build procurement?
It's going to be a fight, and I don't honestly understand why it's a fight. It seems to me common sense. And I spoke at the New York Building Congress yesterday, and I know I had a room full of people who agree with me who help build this city every day. We did I think, working with all our allies, a better job in Albany last time explaining how important it was and gaining support for it. I think we still have to go farther. But I believe if everyone who would benefit from affordable housing, from new schools, from, better roads, if we can make all those voices heard better, I think we can win the day. Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, there's two topics I wanted to ask you about. For the Summer Youth Employment Task Force, when do you expect to get the recommendations, and how much room is there for those recommendations to influence what you have in the budget now?
By well before the executive budget, and there's definitely room. I want to see a clear picture from that task force of what we think the future of summer youth employment should be, what the numbers should be going forward, what the goal we should shoot for is, and also how we ensure it has the impact that a lot of members of council are talking about, and I agree with. If it's a great tool in helping young people on the right path and helping young people avoid the wrong path, I want to make sure it's targeted properly to do that. But the task force has been charged. They should have honestly come back already. That's okay. There's time on the clock. But I think it's basically the next 6 to 8 weeks they have to give us a hard final product, and then we can reflect it in the executive budget.
And the other thing I wanted to ask about is if we could get an explanation about what's happening financially with the money for this 1,500-bed jail where the construction was on pause, if that's still in the capital budget or if that money's been reallocated.
Will you define which one we're talking about?
There have been plans for an additional facility at Rikers, and there was $500 million in the capital budget. It remains in the capital budget. The construction, yes, construction has not begun.
I thought it was paused.
It's everything is status quo, and again, we'll have more to say coming up to the capital budget.
2 parts. One, so what is the budget cushion for operating expenses given the savings?
When you say budget cushion, what do you mean?
What's the percentage of savings to operating expenses? And when you say that reserves are at their highest level, you're talking raw numbers. Are you comfortable with the percentage savings?
So let me just try that. Make sure, Dean, come on over. You're saying percentage-wise, is it also the highest level or just raw number?
I'm asking about the percentage, yeah. I know Controller Stringer and others typically refer to it as the budget cushion and approximately.
You can interpret.
So again, these are the highest level, any way you want to calculate it, of any city administration. The general reserve traditionally is $300 million. It is now $1 billion. There was no capital stabilization reserve, which is now $250 million a year. So the Retiree Health Benefit Trust Fund is at $4 billion, the highest it's ever been, and $3.3 billion is actions that have occurred over the past 3 years here. So these are very high reserves and very high cushions. There are all sorts of theoretical numbers about what you should save and how much you should put aside. We believe that given the conditions that we're facing, that we have actually done dramatic actions in putting reserves aside, and they should not be separated from the savings that we are also doing and the directive by the mayor to find additional savings, which we're also doing.
All right, so I'm going to try and speed it up now so we can get to any last ones. Go ahead.
Capital and the healthcare savings are sort of allocated for those purposes, not to be in reserve for the operating budget. Short.
Yeah, but again, I understand the theory, and Dean, you can jump in if you want. First of all, history tells us that a reserve is a reserve, and as I said, we don't take that lightly. The general reserve is the pure reserve. The capital stabilization reserve is there to protect our ability to make our capital investments and pay the debt service, and the health care benefit fund is there for that purpose. But as Dean said, my predecessor was willing to tap into the reserves, including the health benefit fund, if there was an urgent situation. And then, by the way, you can restore it later in other situations. But that's just one piece of the equation. The savings plan, we already have the savings plan, we're at it. And then if you really saw storm clouds, you can go and cancel future spending in a number of areas. There's a lot of tools in the tool chest. So if you're trying to say, do we want to protect those reserves, the answer is yes, and we are particularly sensitive about the health benefit fund, yes. If your question is, well, why not just keep adding more and more reserves? Great question. Here's the balance point. Because there's a set of strategic things we have to do to keep the economy strong and to keep the city working and to be fair to people. So, for example, you could say, Shouldn't have spent money on 2,000 more cops. I would say that's some of the best money we ever spent. You shouldn't have spent money on repaving. I would say that's been incredibly productive, right? You go down the list. We are always trying to say, what's that balance? We think this is the right reserve number because it's strong reserves, but allows a lot of strategic spending that the city needs. If the reality around us starts to change, we can adjust those we can adjust those numbers. Yeah.
A little clarifying question and then a macro question. DSS, there's homeless spending under the DSS budget as well as DHS, right? Like if we want to know homelessness spending, we should be looking under Department of Social Services.
Well, I'll let the experts speak, but I'd say historically, DHS does direct things like shelter, et cetera, but HRA did things that definitely had an impact on homelessness too, like rental subsidy programs. So that's not new. You could certainly argue to get the full picture of everything we're doing, you have to look at both, but that's not a new phenomenon. Okay.
And then you talk about the real estate slowdown, stuff like that. In terms of the budget, is there a point where a real estate slowdown actually starts to slow down high rents, mean fewer people are homeless, mean the city needs to subsidize less, means fewer people
yeah.
subsidize housing? Or is the revenue loss so great if real estate slows down, it's not worth it?
So look, it's a very theoretical question, perfectly fair question, but very theoretical. If you separate the pieces a little bit and you say, does a real estate slowdown potentially mean lower rents and less demand, therefore, more people might be able to stay in their apartment, there might be less pressure from unscrupulous landlord to evict them, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, of course, that could happen. Now, we've seen some initial signs in the last 6 to 12 months of a slowdown. We'll see how long that goes. And we'll see what happens to the overall economy. But yes, there is a scenario where you see some decrease in the pressure on people's rents. Whether, what it does to our revenue, again, I think it's too early to tell beyond the pretty conservative numbers we gave. One of the things I've learned now, sort of through painful experience over the last few years, is when you have this many moving parts and then like a total wild card in Washington, it's hard to do perfect math. So we try and sort of look at each piece for what it is. The slowdown we're saying right now, I would not say is going to fundamentally affect the affordable housing situation in New York. It might take a little pressure off, but I don't think it's fundamentally changing the rules of the game. On a revenue front, neither is it such a big slowdown to fundamentally change our revenues. Okay, a few more fast. Go ahead.
On the citywide savings plan, can you give us a few examples of how you have achieved the savings so far? And then also, as you're looking at the additional $500 million, are headcount reductions part of what you're looking at?
No, I want to be clear about that. Again, we feel we've been very strategic about the approach to headcount. We're very comfortable with it. We're going to ask each agency to identify things that either aren't working as well as they should, aren't as efficient, money's not being spent on time or not being spent. We're going to look at things that way. Maybe there's a few cases where someone says we don't need the headcount we projected. We would take that into account. But in terms of headcount reductions as a goal, no. Overall, your first question was, how was the previous savings achieved?
The $1.1 billion, about $400 million of that is debt service savings. We remained very aggressive in our refinancings and debt service savings and a recognition of interest rate savings. About $400 million is actually maximizing other reimbursements. And then there's around $300 million, which are agency re-estimates, agency efficiencies. There are examples that we're using. We're being very careful, and actually a citywide effort of our agencies on lease spacing and the efficient use of spacing, better use of lighting. We're doing overtime caps in several of our agencies to make sure that we have both savings as well as don't incur future costs. So there are many areas like that we're doing, and we delineate those in the detailed budget pieces.
Yeah.
When you added the 1,300 cops, that was contingent on the police department staying within an overtime limit. Did they surpass that? I know the situation changed a little bit. Did they go above that? And also, does that remain in place for future use?
Yeah, I think the police department's done a great job on controlling overtime costs. And there's been a real belief in the plan they agreed to. Dean can speak to the overall situation, and we are separating in all things Trump Tower, the X factor of Trump Tower, and our, again, confidence that we will do well on the reimbursement of Trump Tower. So if you're saying all other things, they have stuck to the original vision. Do you agree? Simple enough? Okay. Yeah.
Quick question. You have in the 10-year plan $655 million for the MTA. Is that part of the $2.5 billion you agreed to in 2015, or is this a new?
Let's come back to you on that one. Let the experts work that one through. Go ahead.
One thing that we're not talking about as much here this year as opposed to last year is the way that the state has treated you in their budget and preparing for that. It does seem as though they have, there are fewer measures in the state budget that are detrimental to the city. What do you make of that? Do you think, would you say that your relationship with the governor has improved in the wake of the presidential election? Why are you smiling?
There's such a yearning on the part of my dear friends here to sort of put this dynamic into a simple definition, and I would just urge against that. Let me make it easier for you. I believe we work from a position of strength. I think the very simple construct we've set out for dealing with Albany is the same we'll say for Washington. If you do something good for the people in New York City, we'll work with that. We'll appreciate that. If you do something that hurts the people in New York City, we'll fight it. And that's what happened in the last budget from the state. There were Medicaid cuts, there were CUNY cuts, and we fought it. And we backed them off. And I thank the Assembly, which were tremendous partners in that process. And I think when you stand up and fight and achieve your goal, it helps you not have to fight the next time. So that's just how I live life. I believe that a set of rules has worked. So no, it's not because of any national election dynamics in terms of relationships, but it is about, I think we're just resolute and clear that if something is unfair in New York City, we're going to do something about it. Now, that being said, look, there are some really, as I said, some really good things in this state budget, but there's also some really big question marks. We need to know a lot more on the current education funding. We need to know a lot more on what this change on Campaign for Fiscal Equity means for the future. We need to understand a lot more about some of those smaller cuts that I mentioned, and we certainly need to understand what the real costs of 421A could be. So better than last year, yes, lots of question marks at the same time. Yeah.
Last question for the mayor, and then Dean's going to take over.
When you were updating the capital strategy, did the idea of closing down Rikers come into the discussion?
There's an ongoing discussion. You know, the commission that the city council formed, led by Judge Littman, is still meeting. And we expect to hear back from them in the next couple of months. We've said we were going to work with that commission, not necessarily agree with them all the time, but we would work with them constructively to see if we could think together about the best way forward. We have a natural point coming up with the executive budget to announce a vision for the future. So this was just a very conscious decision to take a little more time, let that commission continue its work, look at the whole picture, and then come back in the coming months with a long-term vision.
Sounds like that's on the table.
Again, I'm choosing scrupulously neutral language so as not to mislead. I've said what I think about the bigger situation. And I've described very vividly all the challenges any change would take. I also understand the attraction of the idea. So we're going to look at all that, stir it in a pot, and come back for the executive budget. Thank you, everyone.
Stay with you for this.